a traffic engineer in your experience? Like, we've been frustrated with them? Yeah, okay, a lot of nodding heads, okay. Well, that's what we're talking about tonight, and I've been trying to think about why my profession frustrates so many people, and is there anything we can do about it, and maybe start a bit of a conversation about it. So let me start off with some telephone calls I get typically, and this is probably where 25% of my work comes from, is a phone call like this. So somebody introduces themselves, hello, my name is, you know, whatever, and then they say, can you recommend an enlightened, and then they go on to describe public works director, traffic engineer, or so forth, that can help our city with some sort of project. Another call we get is, can you help us convince our traffic engineer of something that's very sensible to the business community or the urban designers or so forth, but they have a disagreement with the transportation person. We have a consensus except for one guy. And have you ever heard that before? Can you help us, you know, get past this roadblock in our project or in our initiative? Can you help us fight? And then they go on to describe a number of different things that we help fight, wrong-headed projects or policy changes or something. And we need evidence to counter, again, some usually wrong-headed idea about transportation. And so we get these calls all the time, and they're not calling about other people, they're calling about traffic engineers. And as a traffic engineer, that kind of bothers me. And so I think there's a pattern, that there's some kind of disconnect going on between my profession and a lot of different communities. And I'm trying to come up with reasons why that is. And I think it has to do with the way we look at the world, you know, different paradigms. And so I think there's two competing paradigms in transportation planning. One is what I call traditionalism, and one is what I'm going to call modernism, just for the sake of the discussion tonight. And I'll just cover what those mean. My favorite transportation book was written by this guy named Baker. And he describes in the book everything you need to know as a transportation engineer and road builder. He talks about network, the ratio of access to buildable area. He talks about the purpose of streets. Everything you need to know is in this one book. Now, the book was published first probably 110 years ago, before the car was invented. But it's, in his mind, everything you need to know about transportation is in that book. And it's kind of interesting to look at transportation engineering through the eyes of somebody who's never even seen a car, but is an expert on transportation. And what are the sorts of things that he talked about? Well, he talked about exchange, he talked about communication, he talked about all these sorts of things, and he talked about the speed on the streets. In his day, every street in the city, whether it was a big road like this, a big busy road, or a little local road, every street operated at 4 to 6 miles an hour, which is how fast your horse walked. The horse didn't really care if it was on a big road or a little road. And consequently, the big roads could have retail up to them. They could be highly walkable. People didn't mind living on them. They were great addresses in cities. And what happened as we sped up our roads with sort of more modernist type ideas? Well, the retail pulled away. Nobody wanted to live there. It wasn't the center of the area anymore. It wasn't a thing that connected the city. It became a barrier in the city, and it came about throughput. So this is what the book talked about: connected networks, proximities. It talked about mixes and densities of land uses, creating great addresses. Everything was at slow speeds, walkable environments, and when transit came along, you know, that became another part of the vocabulary of the kind of traditional thinker. This is Detroit's street network before 1949. Highly connected, very transit-oriented, very pedestrian-oriented, you know, big city. And this is little tiny Hillsborough, just a little tiny place out in Oregon. Same ideas of traditional layout of network and direct access to the center. And historically, Transportation technology has helped shape cities from the beginning. Cities started at the junctions of rivers and rivers and rivers and oceans because boats were the main transportation means. And so people wanted to be at those intersections because they could effectively and efficiently do exchange there, bring goods and people together for exchange. So everybody wanted to be near that intersection. When elevators came along, cities could grow up to be more than 3 to 5 stories high, which is how high people were willing to walk. And then when the rails and the trolleys came along, cities could grow along the trolley lines. And so you could live within a short walk of a trolley and still get to downtown and so on. So what was the purpose of cities? Historically, the purpose of cities has been to advance efficient and effective exchange. Social exchange, economic exchange, the exchange of labor, goods, entertainment, social contact, all came together in cities. Cities were not spread apart all over the landscape. They're mechanisms of efficiency, bringing people together for the purposes of exchange. The transportation purpose of cities has always been historically about minimizing long-distance travel. Lots of little trips happening in close proximity, not long trips all over the place. That's why cities formed, for efficiency. And the land use purpose of cities has always been to bring the components of civic life together in cities for the purposes of exchange. So the litmus test for thousands of years for city making has been, does the change reward the short trip and or the transit trip? And what I mean by change is changes in land use, changes in transportation, policy. Anything that happens in cities generally followed that litmus test. When the car came along, cities could develop anywhere you could build a road, which was just about any place. And that marked a big change in the design of cities. Up to that point, the common denominator, are we okay? The common denominator that linked transportation and land use together was the pedestrian, because you had to walk to the trolley or to the water or what have you, or your horse did. When the car came along, the common denominator could be the car. And so for the first time in city history, you did not have to worry about the pedestrian. And so it gave a freedom for design that had never happened before in the world. And so some of the big thinkers back then started dreaming of totally new ways of developing cities. And around 1910, 1920, there was this modernist movement that came out, which had a huge influence on my profession. And if you recall your modernist lessons, it was about simplification. In terms of buildings, buildings became simplified. They didn't have all that ornamentation on it and so forth. And the same thing happened in transportation. I'll illustrate in a moment. So that's a church, very simple church. Simplistic type thinking started to occur. The whole form versus follows function ideas. And they had this imagination about cities where you could have these objects in the landscape and these sort of high-speed corridors to connect them together. And the idea of street was set aside. You just needed to connect these faraway places. And you could actually go to the Grand Canyon in some of these wild ideas and maybe go visit Egypt. And the idea was just to connect these places with high-speed conduits. Again, objects in the landscape connected by high-speed motorways. And so this is one of Corbusier's ideas, was the tower in the park. And his idea was that you could connect these things with fast streets. So this is one of his drawings, a highly influential drawing on how people thought in transportation. That all you needed to do was to connect all of these things quickly and you'd be okay. And so our profession simplified its ideas about streets as well. Streets used to be very multi-purpose places, and it was simplified to basically two ideas, mobility and access. So arterials were mostly about mobility, local streets were mostly about access. Yeah, but where in America do most businesses want to be, retailing and commercial and so forth? They want to be on the arterial. So, access has always been a big part of arterials, and so this was kind of counter to retailing sensibilities and other sensibilities. But that was the idea. And it flew in the face of traditional values where the arterial was a great place, a great address where tremendous economic and social exchange could happen on the edges, very multimodal type place, very beautiful place. And as that got sped up, those roles and functions of the street diminished. Lots of people got in on this. Frank Lloyd Wright came up with ideas about broadacre, different versions of modernism. The industries got involved. This is Henry Ford. He said, we'll solve the problem of the city by leaving the city. And he meant it. Geddes, a modernist architect, came up with the GM exhibit for the World's Fair in 1939 with the magic motorways. And so the idea was you could connect to anything with these motorways, and you could move around in your personal transportation. Now, this was all made possible by also the idea of experts. And the affairs of the citizens shouldn't be trusted to themselves. They should be guided and conducted by experts. And so traffic engineers were experts, and they knew what to do to help society. And so Henry Barnes was one such expert. He was a very influential traffic engineer. He helped remove trolleys from many cities. So he was putting in kind of modernist ideas and removing more traditional ideas from cities. A lot of these ideas were embodied in the research and the textbooks of the day. Colin Buchanan's book called Traffic and Towns was a hugely influential book. That was when I started that was considered the Bible. It was on my shelf. Very, very modernist kind of leaning. Things that were really important were levels of service, minimizing delays, fighting congestion, separation of different modes, kind of like the antithesis of traditional thinking. And a lot of that thinking is in our technical books. It's in the Highway Capacity Manual. When you read the first chapter, it talks about the words and the value sets that go with those words. And it's usually about how many cars can cross a line in an hour, delays, levels of service, and this sort of thing. Ideas that promote longer trip making and usually higher speeds. So this is the sort of simpler view of the capacity of streets, how many cars can cross a line in an hour. But we all know that streets have the capacity to do a number of things, particularly arterial streets, which tends to be the rub. They can be great addresses for businesses. They can be recreational facilities. They can create identity. They have all these different roles traditionally, which aren't reflected in sort of modernist thinking. There's what we call the greater good argument, which makes a lot of sense from a certain perspective. If you have tens of thousands of drivers going down a street and there's only perhaps a few hundred residents and businesses nearby, the greater good argument says we should alter the street and the intersections to help the majority who are going through the area. Now, as we help those people, quite often we disadvantage those in the area. So rewarding the long trip, the through trip, at the expense of the local trip, the pedestrian trip, the transit trip, and perhaps the place. So the modernist thinking is that lower travel times and higher speeds, more car carrying capacity and less congestion are inherently good. And a lot of us believe that. But when you apply those ideas to every link and intersection, particularly on the arterial roads, what it does, it continually rewards the long trip, and what happens is it tends to export value out of the city to the suburbs, and we've seen that happen in just about every city where the long trip is rewarded at the expense of the city, and value and people investment tends to leave the city and go into the suburbs. So this is Richmond, Virginia, probably about 80 years ago. This is Broad Street. You know, you can see there's a ton of exchange going on. So they've obviously rewarded the short trip and the transit trip in this picture. This map shows Richmond, and if you look, these sort of white bands that surround the roads, those are the walking contours to the trolley lines. So just about everybody in Richmond was within a close walk of a trolley line. So obviously for a long time, this city had a policy of rewarding the short trip and or the transit trip, and had those wonderful outcomes in terms of social and economic exchange on their main shopping street. Until 1949, when they switched their paradigm towards modernist transportation thinking. So that's what it used to be like on Broad Street, and that's what the view is today. So they have systematically rewarded the long trip on Broad Street at the expense of the short trip and the transit trip, which has dramatically reduced social and economic exchange in the downtown. Now they have 2 university campuses, and it's the capital city. This should be a very vibrant place, but because of that paradigm shift, they've completely altered the character of the downtown. So here's 2 streets, let's say, an orange street and a red street. And let's assume for a moment there's 18,000 cars a day crossing a line. That's what we would call the traffic volume on the street. Let's assume for a moment that the average trip length on the orange street is 2 miles, and the average trip length on the red street is 6 miles. So from a trip-making perspective, there's probably 3 times more trips happening on the orange street than on the red street. Now, a lot of people would look at just this number, the 18,000, and say these streets are about the same from a traffic perspective. But if you believe that exchange has something to do with the success of cities, then this one has a lot more vibrancy than that one. These folks are going through, and these folks are actually doing something in the locality. They have many more trip ends, a lot more business going on, a lot more socializing going on. Now let's say that the traffic dropped down to maybe 15,000, but the average trip length went from 2 miles to 1 mile. Then, even with less traffic, there's a lot more trip making going on. So this has something to do with vibrancy, and just about every city wants to be more vibrant. So the cities that reward the short trip instead of the long trip with even less volume will have much more trip making, much more social and economic exchange, and thus be a better city. And so this is a very traditional idea compared to just looking at the volumes and thinking that all else is equal. So we get more vibrancy with more trip making. Now when you think about it, as those trip lengths get smaller, some people will choose to use a bicycle, some people will choose to walk. And when you get lots of walking trips, sometimes we don't even count those, but then you get very, very vibrant places. So you can see what happened here. They did the exact opposite. They lengthened their trips. This is still a very busy road in terms of volume, but totally annihilated their trip making. Network. This is a traditional network of Savannah. This is a more modernist, hierarchical-based network in Irvine, California. And notice, you have to add up these trips on bigger roads because it's like a grapevine. And when you get to the trunk of the grapevine, the roads get very wide. And so from a walkability perspective, it's very easy to walk through a network. It's like walking up a bunch of stairs. But when you get these big streets, they become barriers in the community And they're very hard to walk up or walk across. Also, network affects the way folks build, the way they develop. With a connected network of blocks, we're more likely to break up the land uses at a scale that's more human scale. With the dendritic hierarchy, with the large roads, we tend to develop at an automobile scale. So on the left, we tend to, again, encourage the longer trip, and on the right, we tend to encourage the shorter trip. And then when we assign our trips to those networks, all the traffic tends to have to use the big road because it's the only routing option. But with the connected network, there's many routing options, and we can spread loads. Thus, each street can be a little smaller, and it's more easily designed to be what we call a complete street, where you can walk or cycle or drive along it. Like, remember the network in Detroit? Well, this is what happened to it. After the Second World War, Detroit had an incredible amount of money. They had produced so much material for the war effort, and not one bomb got dropped on Detroit. They were quite a wealthy city and wanted to be a top world city. And they embraced modernism probably more strongly than any other city in the United States. So they built a lot of highways, and they even built towers in the park and took away their street network. And right away, as they started building those highways, it had a negative effect on the traditional layout of the city, and places started to deteriorate. Population started to move out of the city along the highways, and disinvestment happened in Detroit. The disinvestment and the exodus of people from, there was a 2 million person city almost, and it went down to about 600,000. Started right away, predated foreign car competition, the oil crisis in the 70s, the race riots, all that stuff. You can map out the decline of the population in terms of the highway building. And they had wonderful theaters, places of cultural exchange. Here's one of them. You know, look at the beautiful columns. This is the lobby of this, the Michigan Theater. And here it is today. Those are the same columns. They turned it into a parking garage because they needed the parking, because everybody had left and become car dependent, and they drove back, and nobody wanted to be around here anymore. So there's where the old stage was. So this theater is a bit of a metaphor, for the entire city. That's the network we keep seeing, and this is what it looks like today. So you can see how that very traditional network of connected streets has been cut apart with the highways and the towers in the park. Now, when we were working in Detroit, the traffic engineer said to us, well, we need these highways and wide arterials in case the 2 million people come back. And we said, well, this is the network that supported 2 million people. This is the network that supports 600,000 people and an exodus to the suburbs. If you want the 2 million people to come back, maybe you should build a traditional network instead of something that encourages the opposite. Interestingly, we're now in conversation with the Michigan DOT on removing one of those major highways, I-375, and restoring the traditional street network. And most people who look at this idea know that investment will come back, that connections will happen, as these traditional values get built back into the city. There's the drawing that Corbusier drew, and here's a representation of it in Milwaukee. So there's the highway built through Milwaukee, and it severed a bunch of city blocks and created a lot of disinvestment through the city. Didn't provide much access, even though cities are really about access and exchange. This is the city's imagination of not having the highway. So there's the highway, and look what's around it. Parking lots on the waterfront. And this is without the highway. This is their imagination of what it will turn into, and that's what's happening after they took the highway out. Investments coming back to the city, as traditional values replace the modernist values. This is Savannah, Georgia. This is the place we all think about Savannah, the old part. But this is Abercorn Street, and it chronicles about 200 years of transportation thinking. And when you go downtown, you know, the original part of the city, in this square there's about 32 miles of streets and about 10,000 square feet per hectare of footprint. As you move out down Abercorn Street, you'll notice that the miles of streets drops, and so does the footprint of the buildings. So you get to the historic neighborhoods, again, the same pattern happens. You get less streets, less density. Now we're into the suburban areas, more modern ideas. You know, much less street and far less footprint on the ground. You get into the retailing area, same thing. The numbers drop. And also the character has been changing as we've been moving out of the city dramatically. Now we're into the big box area, same pattern again. So I graphed this, and so here's the street length in miles, and there's the footprints of the buildings. This is the old part of town, and there's an incredible correlation when you graph it out. Now, if you look at the patterns, you know, we've done a number of projects in Savannah, and there's a pretty good consensus that the quality of life is higher towards this end of the spectrum compared to out here. The character is richer over here than in here. Tourism is more successful over here than in the newer areas. The aesthetics are superior in the older parts than in the brand new parts. Walkability is higher. Property values are higher. But traffic problems are higher out here. Now, the interesting thing is everybody likes what's up here, but all of their rules and laws and practices reflect sort of modernist ideas, and they have to do this. This is required, and though nobody likes it. Things are changing, though. There's a lot of people in my profession who are reforming, and they're writing books about it, too. This is a smart transportation guide to encourage practitioners to think more traditionally. The ITE and the CNU cooperated on a wonderful guidebook, helping foster the similar changes in thinking. In LA, they've developed this model street design guidelines. So now we have a choice of the sorts of traffic engineers that cities can use and hire to do different projects. So this was the modernist idea that transportation planning was separate from land use planning, that the inputs were traffic demand forecast modeling, levels of congestion, and levels of service. And those inputs resulted in transportation projects, which affected land use and so forth. But the outcomes were negative in general. People didn't like what happened. Traditionally, we looked at transportation and land use at the same time. With modernist ideas, we went away from that, but I think we're coming back to it. We call it community planning. Some people call it smart growth. At the end of the day, though, the outcomes are better economically and socially and environmentally. We need to talk about vision. Vision is the collective imagination of how the city ought to be in the future. And usually you hear things like we want a vibrant place, a beautiful place, a place to grow up, to be successful, a safe place. But how do we get to achieve our visions? So here's a slide of white, black, and gray tiles. Now some of you might have seen this before, so don't say anything. But those of you who haven't, can you tell me what that slide means? Anybody have any ideas? You can do a statistical analysis if you want of how many white tiles are next to gray tiles, and maybe you can add them up. Any guesses?
A picture of Lincoln?
Yeah, it's a picture of Abraham Lincoln. So if you can't see it, squint your eyes and blur your vision. Can you see it now? Or if you have glasses, just tip your glasses up and Is it clearer now? Yeah, now you can see him? Okay. So for those of you who can't see him, I took the same photograph and I blurred the lens of my camera, and that's what that mosaic looks like with the lens blurred. It's actually quite clear now, isn't it? That's Abraham Lincoln. Now in city making, it's kind of like the pixels in the mosaic. There's lots of different people that help make cities. Traffic engineers, planners, architects, builders, and so on. And to achieve a vision, they all need to pull in the same direction. Now, if one of those pixels is outshining or too dark or so forth, it spoils the picture. And so the idea is that traffic engineers need to do their piece of the picture, whatever that might be, and pull in the same direction to achieve the big picture. So to become successful, cities need a vision and they need what we call predictability. And the vision is the consensus on the way the city ought to be, and the predictability comes through planning, a feasible way of achieving the vision over time. So let me talk a little bit about a couple of examples of cities that have gone through this. This is what I call the West Palm story in West Palm Beach. I was the city traffic engineer there for 5 years. And when I got there, the city was what I would call challenged. Anybody who could had left the city to the suburbs. My predecessors had one-wayed and sped up the roads as much as they can. Levels of service for motorists were more important than any other consideration in our city. We took away on-street parking to aid the motorists through. People left, they became car dependent, and then they drove back to the city, and then we started tearing down buildings to make surface parking lots, harming walkability. So we started undoing a very traditional city in an imagination of creating a kind of a modern city where you could drive quickly to various other places. And then we ended up with 80% vacancies on our main shopping street. We had $7,000 in reserves when we hit rock bottom. We had a huge drug issue and prostitution issue in the city. There was no development going on whatsoever, and our streets were just horrible places. And this is where all the people moved to, out into the Everglades. And so here's a big development. There's Everglades, and there's what allowed it to happen. We were building big arterials out to the Everglades to allow those people to become car dependent and then drive back into the city. And this is what the figure ground looks like for West Palm Beach when we got there. All the white spaces were parking lots or just where buildings had been torn down and were fields. So we had a very hollowed out city. And this is what it looked like, just empty parking lots, boarded up buildings, underutilized space. Just a very depressing place. Do you remember that idea about experts being in charge? Well, the mayor at the time didn't agree with that, and she agreed with Thomas Jefferson that the ultimate powers of the society needs to be with the people. And if we don't think they're enlightened enough to exercise their control with wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. So in the past, the traffic engineers had taken the power from the community and had built these car conduits, and she didn't like that idea, and so she got everybody together in big meetings, and we talked about it. And so we involved all sorts of stakeholders. We just didn't inform them what was going on. We collaborated with folks and empowered them to change their city because we couldn't get any worse. So these are some of the meetings we had, and we developed a plan. We had a vision of a very traditional, beautiful, successful, vibrant city, and we came up with a plan. And we drew what the city ought to look like, and imagined what the buildings could look like and what are now vacant properties. And we codified it. So now we had both vision and predictability. My job was to match the vision with streets. And my predecessors had been busy widening and straightening and speeding up, and we couldn't do that anymore because there was just no space. We'd narrowed the sidewalks as much as we could. We took off the parking. You notice the bushes growing out of the broken windows here of this vacant building. You know, the place, you couldn't do any more conventional projects on there. Now, I'd only been out of school for like 10 years, and you know, I didn't really know what to do. But I could see what had harmed the place, and it looked like way too much space was put out there for the car. So I just did my best and decided to follow my more traditional instincts. So what we ended up doing here was we narrowed the street to 2 lanes, made wide sidewalks, beautified it with trees, slowed it down with raised intersections. So we exchanged modernist value sets in transportation with traditional ones, and that building is now occupied. This was a 4-lane commuter route cutting through this neighborhood. I turned it into a 2-lane commuter route with lateral shifts, and we used the surplus space to build a linear park. Again, traditional values replacing modernist values. This was a 5-lane state arterial that was built through this neighborhood in the 1970s to help commuters from faraway places get to downtown. We turned it into a 2-lane street with nice wide sidewalks, trees, raised intersections at the 2 elementary schools along the way to help the kids cross the street. Again, rewarding the short trips and the sustainable trips over the long trips. This was just an ugly street in the downtown that we made beautiful, made it very pedestrian friendly. This was a 1-way main street. This was where we had 80% vacancies on our main shopping street, and we 2-wayed it, again, rewarding the short direct trip over the through trip. At the end of the street, we took away the turn lanes, the signals, we raised that up to sidewalk level, again, rewarding the short trip, the walking trip, and made it into a place. And investment started coming back to the city instead of migrating out to the suburbs. We made places for people to congregate and to play. We built places for people to sit down and relax. We gave facade grants to places so that they could fix up the public room, the outdoor room of the street, the buildings. And the owners, so there's what it looks like after. And now there's a waiting list to get into what was a vacant building. And where prostitutes used to hang out on the corner, now they can enjoy a nice lunch at the new restaurant that moved in. And then mixed-use buildings started to pop up. This was an old bus station. Now it's a beautiful mixed-use building. Here's another mixed-use building, a really large one, and this is one of the main arterials that goes through town. And this is where the rub happened with the county. The county engineers in their models said that we had to widen the roads because all those empty lots, we were building big buildings on it. And according to the modeling, the city was going to get very congested because it was already congested when we started. And if we increased all these land uses in the absence of transit, it was going to get super, super duper congested. But I was narrowing the road. So this like blew the minds of these folks who really believed in the sort of the modernist ideas of transportation. And they said this was impossible, and we were going to just shut down the city. We attracted grocery stores, affordable housing. These empty spaces turned into vibrant spaces. If you look closely, you see that building right there? That's the same building. So we got all this mixed use happening, and the congestion never got worse. The models were wrong. The city isn't the same as what they modeled. It's a different city now. It's a far better city. It's a much more traditional city that people walk and have a lot of social exchange and economic exchange in it now. This was an old building that we renovated, and now it's a place. You know, a lot more trip making, lots and lots more trips. No more traffic though, just lots more trips. So all those changes rewarded the short trip in West Palm Beach. A couple of other examples. This is in Maryland. This is Rockville Pike. Big arterial leaving the north of Washington, D.C. And it got so busy, even though there's a transit station, it got so busy that the county wouldn't allow any more development in here. And all this first generation kind of suburban development was kind of stuck because they couldn't redevelop anything because they didn't have any trips on the big arterial. There's the transit station, but you couldn't walk there. So this is what it's like to walk along that street. Very difficult to cross the street. I believe those ladies are still waiting for a gap to cross the street. Really hostile place. And that's what it looks like on the sides. Again, the idea was you can drive to the different objects in the landscape and you didn't have to worry about the pedestrian. You know, this could be anywhere in the United States on these similar arterials. So these folks in red, the private property owners, actually hired us to help figure this out. And we looked at the street network and we came up with a more traditional street network, more connections, more places to turn, more access. And then with the network, you can see we're rewarding the short trip. These are the pedestrian walks to the transit station compared to what they used to be. So much easier to walk around. And then we planned a BRT down the middle of the arterial with a little circulator bus, creating a very robust transit system in the area. And with the network and the transit, it allowed us to come up with a design for the arterial, which is a complete street, with a double row of trees down the middle, double rows of trees down the edges, beautiful protected bike lanes, wide sidewalks, just like the old traditional pictures. And so this arterial is going to go from a mobility-oriented, simplistic idea to a multifaceted, vibrant place of huge social and economic exchange because we replaced the modernist values with traditional values. This parcel is owned by one of the property owners who wanted to redevelop, and this is their imagination of what it's going to look like. And these are renderings, and now the buildings are getting built. It's actually happening. Investment is coming back to that community. The pressures of sprawl that big arterial created are starting to reverse themselves, and people are moving back into these transit-oriented places. The huge success story. Everything about that project, all those changes reward the short trip and the transit trip, a very traditional idea. Second last example, this is in rural Virginia, west of Washington, D.C., in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Just beautiful farmland, very horsey country, incredibly historic, a lot of Civil War battles and so on. Just gorgeous rural America. And there's these little towns along Route 50, and they have these still functioning main streets. They're just gorgeous places. Now, the Virginia DOT was rewarding the long trip along these main streets by turning the main street into what looks like the highway outside of town. And it was starting to harm the towns. Outside of one of the towns, they'd actually four-laned the freeway. Now, if you go towards Washington, you can see where they started four-laning and six-laning Route 50 out of D.C. The development patterns started changing. Sprawl started following the widenings of the road. Now, in our area, in the 1970s, the Virginia DOT did a traffic demand forecast model. Now, the volume was about 18,000 cars in the foothills, and the DOT predicted that it would be 30,000 cars within 20 years, which required the road to be expanded to 4 lanes. In the 80s, the forecasts were repeated, and there was about 18,000 cars on the road, and they said that in 20 years there'd be about 30,000 cars. In the 90s, the forecasts were repeated again. There was about 18,000 cars on the road at the time, and we had to widen the road to 4 lanes because the traffic was coming. Now, when I got involved in the project, there was about 18,000 cars on the road, and the more robust, better modeling said that in 20 years there'd be 30,000 cars on the road. Now, it wasn't lost on the community that that's 25 years after those forecasts, and the volumes hadn't changed. So again, the modeling got it dead wrong. These forecasts could only come true if the road was widened. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was induced traffic that would make that come true. Now, when we got there, it was a context-sensitive design project. The question was, which side of the 3 towns should the bypass go on? They couldn't put the 4 lanes down the main street, so they had to go on one side or the other. So everybody on the north side said, well, it needs to go on the south side, and everyone on the south side said it needs to go on the north side, and there was a bitter fight, divided the towns in half. And we were also asked, how do you design the best highway bypass ever in such a beautiful setting? And what we did was we changed the context-sensitive design project into a context-sensitive solutions project, which means that we didn't have to build the bypasses. So the question changed to, what's the community's vision for the area? How should the area ought to be in the long run? And everybody thought, in the long run, it should be beautiful and pristine and gorgeous and rural like it is now. And was the bypass consistent with that vision? No, absolutely not. It was not consistent. So the decision was, we're not building the bypass. We are going to fulfill the vision of the community. So everybody got involved. There's the mayor. Everybody's got around maps and thought, okay, how do we make this vision happen? There's a bunch of reports made, an original study. And so what happened was, historically, if there's one of the towns, that the street was going through the town. Over time, the street was specialized for throughput, with modernist ideas, rewarding the longer trip, dividing the town in half. Now, the DOT's idea was to build bypasses, but the consensus idea was instead to alter the design of the main street so that the town functions and the traffic functions could coexist by slowing things down, making them accessible, making it pedestrian friendly. And that became the vision. Now there's a couple of people in the room who were part of those battles and remember how the fight was with the DOT. Now eventually the DOT came on board and became our client, and this got built. And now they look at it as a great example of smart growth. But here's what the intersection was and what it's going to be. There's some of the little Main Street visions. And the idea was you'd have high speeds between the towns, low speeds in the town, 25 miles an hour, and then transition zones and entryway features. So the DOT hired us. We did plans for the towns, and it's since been implemented. So in 2005, there were still 18,000 cars, and there's probably still 18,000 cars there now. Again, even in a rural place, all the thinking was to reward the short trip. The last example I want to show you is Vancouver, Canada. A very large city, growing city, population going up, economy rising. But what's going down are the traffic volumes. So they've got lots and lots of trips, lots and lots of little trips, but less traffic. They've got wonderful buildings, a lot of investment coming into here. But what struck us, we met with a lot of the current planners there, and we also met with the former planners, the planners that were in charge of the city in the 70s, the people who stopped the highway building and didn't allow it to come into Vancouver, even though the fashion of the day was modernism and we were putting highways and widening highways in cities. They did not agree with that. They said, no, we're more traditionally minded, we're not doing that. And we heard this over and over. It's not about balance. They said it's about priorities. If your priority is walkability, if your priority is economic exchange and jobs, if your priority is safety, that's what you invest in. Again, the litmus test in Vancouver was they are supporting short trips and transit trips. So we've looked at old places, capitals, big places, little towns, rural towns, huge city. In every single case where traditional values have been employed, the places have got better, and where modernist values were employed, the places got worse. So I would argue that the transportation purpose of cities is still efficient and effective exchange. I would also argue that the transportation purpose of cities is to minimize long-distance travel. And I would suggest that the land use purpose of cities is to concentrate the components of civic life. And I think in a lot of cities, you see initiatives all along those lines, increasing densities, mixes, walkability initiatives, and so forth. But what's out of step in many cities is the traffic engineer. But now we have two types of traffic engineers. We have those who still lean modern, and we have a whole new group of traffic engineers emerging that I showed you some of the books they've been writing about that support more traditional values. So the point is to align your city's vision with your staffing choices. So if you're having trouble, think about the values of your community, the values expressed in your comprehensive planning, and have those values shared by your entire staff. And so we won't have this sort of thing where the traffic engineer is pulling in the other direction of your traditional city. Now, if your city's modernist, sure, hire a modernist traffic engineer. But I think a growing number of cities are leaning traditional in their thinking. And if that's the case, you need to align your staff accordingly. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and entertain any discussion or questions. Thank you.